Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program for Monday, June 28th. It's titled Collecting the COVID Era? Question mark at the end there. That's important. We are going to be getting started in just a moment or so. We're letting in participants from the waiting room now, so sit back and relax. We appreciate your patience. We will be starting in just a minute or two. Thanks. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program titled Collecting the COVID Era. It's going to be a live online presentation by Randall Tarpey-Schwed, and we will be getting started in just a moment. We have a few more folks, I think, entering from the waiting room. So again, sit back, relax. We will be starting in just a moment or so. Thanks. Good evening, everyone. It's a few minutes past the top of the hour, so I think we're going to get started. Participants can join us while we're in progress, but we'll just kick off this webinar by welcoming you. So good evening again, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program titled Collecting the COVID Era, a live online presentation by Randall Tarpey-Schwed. He's author, collector, and past president of the Book Club of California. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the executive director of the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight and host this webinar. Tonight, we have more than 75 people registered for this online presentation. So for those of you who are new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor supported organization dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the literature and history of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, and much, much more. If you're not a member of the book club, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, but the benefits are many. We simply cannot do the work that we do without the support of our members. So I encourage you to visit our website at bccbooks.org to join or donate to the book club. And now for tonight's program and our presenter. The program is titled Collecting the COVID Era. It's a live online presentation by Randall Tarpey-Schwed, author, collector, and past president of the book club. So Randall Tarpey-Schwed is a bibliophile and a collector with a special interest in gastronomy. And with the author, Donald Zealand, he authored MFK Fisher, an annotated bibliography. He frequently speaks to audiences at the book club about his specialty and his collecting interests. In 2008, he curated an exhibition and edited a keepsake titled MFK Fisher, A Delicious Obsession. And he was the author for Plate by Plate, California Recipes from the Gold Rush through California Cuisine, the 2013 members keepsake. He delivered a featured lecture at the book club's 2014 symposium titled A Feast for the Eyes, Gastronomy and Fine Print. And his essays have been published in the book club's quarterly newsletter. He's currently on the Book Club of California's board of directors, and he is the immediate past president of the board. He's also a member of the Roxburgh Club and the Grolier Club. Tonight, Randall will be discussing collecting during these very interesting times that we are living in, specifically around collecting during the global pandemic and collecting the global pandemic. The year 2020 began with the World Health Organization's announcement of a cluster of pneumonia cases that quickly evolved to become the largest health crisis the planet has experienced in over 100 years. By examining books, broadsides, and ephemeral items created during an earlier and longer lasting health crisis, Randall Tarpey-Schwed will reflect on what we can learn from such objects and how they can help us to humanize the statistics and better understand the times that we're going through. He'll talk about the collecting areas for those wishing to acquire objects being created today, objects that might help us to better understand and humanize the COVID era. So if you have questions for our presenter, please use the chat and the Q&A function in Zoom. We should have some time at the end of the hour to take questions, and we'll curate those from the Q&A and the chat. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Randall Tarpey-Schwed and pass over the controls for tonight's webinar. Randall, it's all yours.
Terrific. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Collecting the COVID Era. When Kevin and I started a dialogue a couple of months ago about my giving a talk at the Book Club of California, I had a very general notion that this period we've been living through the last 18 months has many lessons to teach us, and that there might be an opportunity to explore how the objects and images that we've encountered during this era, most of which are completely new to our collective experiences, might be able to help us make sense of the era in some small way. But because we're still very much in the middle of the experience, I confess that I've had a hard time getting enough distance from it to gain the perspective I've been seeking. And I expect many of you may have had a similar experience. But I believe that we book lovers, and I think particularly those of us who also call ourselves collectors, have some tools and techniques that enable us to try to derive meaning, or at least some lessons from human experiences that sometimes seem like they're otherwise without meaning. And we often use the various records of our human experience, as well as seemingly unrelated objects in that exercise. And that's what I'm going to be talking about this evening. Now, at this point, I'm going to stop my thumbnail video so that you're not distracted by me, because I'd really like you to be able to just focus on the slides at this point. The Scottish historian and bibliophile John Hill Burton, in describing the nature of collectors, said the following, quote, "The general ambition of the class, collectors, is to find value where there seems to be none. And this develops a certain skill and subtlety, enabling the operator in the midst of a heap of rubbish to put his finger on those things which have in them the latent capacity to become valuable and curious." And to sort of expand on this notion, my friend Ben Kinmont, who's a brilliant artist and an antiquarian bookseller, introduced me to the concept that collecting actually adds to human culture by creating knowledge and by giving meaning to objects. And those contributions to human culture from collecting can take many forms: articles, books, talks like this one, exhibitions, and artwork, and many other kinds of artistic expression. And the combination of the collected objects themselves, as well as the cultural production that results from the collecting process, actually changes how we understand one another. And people and institutions, particularly museums, are already busy working to create these products of cultural exploration in the COVID era by acquiring like mad. And here are a couple of recent headlines. The New York Times in March of last year reported that museums were, quote, "scrambling to document the pandemic, even as it was unfolding." The next month, Smithsonian Magazine devoted an entire article to describing how the museums of the Smithsonian complex were developing strategies to collect objects related to the COVID era. And in August, the New York Times did a fascinating story in their art and design section called "The Strange Lives of Objects in the Coronavirus Era." They profiled what they called the flurry of new and novel items being created during the pandemic. And among those items were the coronavirus piñata, which you see on your left. And on your right, you can see the hug tunnel, designed for those unable to bear the lack of human contact during enforced distancing. And you can understand why museums would be acquiring artifacts of this type. The COVID-19 pandemic is one of the most significant health crises the planet has endured since the flu pandemic of 1918. To take you back to that pandemic, I've shown you the front page of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution for October 8th, 1918. Right below the main headline about the Allies demanding an unconditional surrender from Germany is the announcement that public gathering places had been closed by the city council for 2 months to stop the spread of the so-called Spanish flu. The 1918 pandemic was labeled the, quote, Spanish flu, not because it was first detected in Spain, but rather because as a neutral country, Spain was not subject to the same press censorship as the warring countries and was freely reporting on the pandemic. But as all rational people understand, viruses do not have nationalities. So with that sentiment in mind, I also won't be calling the 1918 pandemic the Spanish flu. Now, I wasn't around for the 1918 flu pandemic, but I was very much alive during what was actually, at least as measured by the number of deaths, America's worst infectious disease crisis of the last century. And that was the HIV AIDS crisis. Okay, fine, you may be saying, but what does this have to do with collecting? I think that there's sort of an innate human instinct to try to make sense out of seemingly random and often unpredictable events, or if not to make sense of them, then to at least find some meaning from the events. And by meaning, I don't mean answers to the question, why did this happen? I think those questions are really unanswerable. But I do think that it's entirely human to ask if any lessons can be drawn from crises, and importantly, whether there's any good that comes out of a generally horrific experience. And if you look again at John Hill Burton's quote, I've slightly modified it to say that collectors sometimes find meaning rather than value in random objects, though meaning certainly has value. And that sense of meaning that is sometimes a product of the collecting process can be intellectual, emotional, or perhaps even spiritual or some combination. And that's really what this presentation tonight is about. I suspect some of you tonight here are old enough to remember 1981. On this slide, I've listed a few fun facts to refresh our memories about that year. Ronald Reagan was our president. In England, Charles and Diana had the royal wedding of the century. The space shuttle Columbia had its first mission. The short-lived but super cool DeLorean motor car made its debut. And the high school class of 1981, which included me, graduated. And just a few weeks after I threw my graduation cap into the air, the Los Angeles Times reported in an article that was buried in the middle of page 3 that cases of a rare lung infection, pneumocystis pneumonia, had appeared in 5 young, previously healthy gay men in Los Angeles. This marked the first official reporting in this country of what would become known as the AIDS epidemic. In essence, my entry into adulthood coincided with the start of the AIDS epidemic. And even though over the years I lost a few friends to AIDS, I never dwelt on it. In fact, I wanted to move through it and to put it all behind me as fast as I could. It was only a quarter century later, through the process of collecting, that I was able to derive some sense of meaning about that period. And that experience is now informing how I think about the COVID era. And here's that collecting story. In the early 2000s, I was working with my research partner, Donald Zeeland, on the first comprehensive bibliography of the great American writer, MFK Fisher. As part of my research effort, I set about to try to acquire anything ever produced that contained writing by or about Fisher, so that I could examine these objects and make sure they were properly described in the bibliography. And among the things that I acquired in this process were 2 MFK Fisher broadsides. People Ask Me on the left, which was printed by Alastair Johnson, and Milquetoast on the right, printed by Peter Koch. I learned that these broadsides were part of a larger work called Aid and Comfort, the Artist's Portfolio. This was a fundraiser to support organizations assisting people with AIDS, with recipes donated by some of the Bay Area's best restaurants, and quotes from famous food writers who had lent their permission to the project. And this was done alongside a gala $250 a plate dinner and concert that was held at Fort Mason in San Francisco. The genesis for the dinner part of the project was Vince Calcano, one of the owners of San Francisco's Zuni Cafe, who after losing 5 friends to AIDS in a single month felt that he needed to do something. And he partnered with Alice Waters on the event, and a lot of accomplished and talented people worked on this effort. In the interest of time, I'm going to scroll very quickly through the following slides to illustrate all the broadsides in the full portfolio. But if you're interested, I encourage you to find a copy of this portfolio. I believe the San Francisco Public Library has one in special collections, and full portfolios do occasionally come up for sale. In total, there were 23 broadsides and 10 artist reproductions. This was really the first item that I collected that had been created in response to the HIV AIDS crisis. And in retrospect, I realized that at the time I appreciated it primarily for the high quality of the broadsides and the connection to the evolution of 20th century food culture in California, rather than the fact that it was an AIDS fundraiser. But I started searching out and acquiring more objects related to this fundraiser. Here's a copy of the menu for the dinner itself. Here we had 14 dishes and 5 wines. I don't know who printed this, but it is a nice production. The event was a success, and it netted at least $500,000 for the AIDS charities it was supporting. I acquired a thank you letter that was written from Alice Waters and Vince Calcano to one of the volunteers who helped. And I blacked out the recipient's name out of respect for their confidentiality, but I think this letter is really poignant. And I especially like the middle paragraph, which says, quote, "Do not think of your contribution as remote. Someone who is sick will get groceries, a bed, or have their rent paid, thanks to you." 3 years later, there was a follow-up fundraising dinner and concert, Aid and Comfort 2, at the Greek Theater at UC Berkeley. And here are some materials from the program that I acquired. And for the second fundraiser, the participants could have a grand dinner on the hillside or more casual box dinner, which was available in either American, Asian, or Mediterranean styles. So this cool menu, which is die cut in the shape of the Statue of Liberty, was for the American style box dinner. And I also acquired this interesting promotional broadside that requires some explanation. Bill Graham had helped to produce the musical entertainment for the first Aid and Comfort fundraiser, which included folks like Linda Ronstadt, Boz Scaggs, Carlos Santana, and Herbie Hancock. The organizers of the second Aid and Comfort event were trying to convince Graham to help with this event. And this is actually a proof of the poster printed on wonderful Japanese paper that was given to Graham with handwritten appeals from people on the team. At the lower left corner, you can see that Alice Waters circled her name and wrote, "Bill, we can't do this without you." And Tom Luddy from Zoetrope, who had partnered with Graham on the first production, wrote, "Bill, you must be with us. The musicians will relax with you backstage to kick ass if the set changes are slow, et cetera, et cetera. Plus, you can take the mic if there are some open spots." In case you're wondering, these personal handwritten appeals worked, and Bill Graham did co-produce the event. And slowly over time, I started acquiring other interesting items created as a response to the HIV/AIDS crisis. In 1985, a San Francisco grandmother named Ruth Brinker started cooking meals in her own kitchen for 7 neighbors with AIDS, and that was the genesis of Project Open Hand. They published a fundraising cookbook, and the cover illustrations were done by an artist named Deborah Zemke. But the editor of the cookbook, Robert Schneider, initially had some even grander ideas for the cover. This is a letter I acquired in which Schneider wrote to the artist David Hockney, explaining the project and asking for an original David Hockney illustration for the cover. Now, David Hockney is one of the world's greatest living artists. In 2018, this painting, An Artist, Pool with Two Figures, sold at Christie's for $90 million, which was at the time the highest figure ever paid for a work by a living artist. Hockney did not, alas, do a painting for the cover of the Open Hand Cookbook. But one of the things that strikes me is that there's an element of bravery in the way that many people involved in these projects operated. Why not ask one of the world's greatest living artists to donate a painting so that some very sick people who might otherwise go hungry could have a good meal? My copy of the Open Hand Cookbook was inscribed by the editor, Robert Schneider, to John Ferrone, who was a longtime editor at Harcourt. And next to that is an invitation to the publication party that you can see. I suspect that John Ferrone may have provided some help or advice on the project. And there was a second Open Hand Cookbook project 2 years later. This one was edited by Stanley Eichelbaum, who was the Chronicle's food columnist, and my copy is inscribed by Eichelbaum. And over the years, I tried to acquire menus related to the Bay Area's response to the AIDS crisis when I could find them. On the left is an early example, the AIDS Emergency Fund's kickoff dinner, and next to that is a menu from a Project Open Hand fundraising luncheon. And although my focus was primarily on the Bay Area's response, in New York, the non-sectarian but wonderfully named God's Love We Deliver began providing meals at about the same time as Project Open Hand. And here are some scarce early promotional materials from that organization that I've collected. And they published this nice cookbook, which has recipes from both celebrities and chefs. So you can get recipes from Ina Garten and Alice Waters, but also from Isabella Rossellini and Cyndi Lauper. Okay, so I've shown you about 30 or so objects on this theme that I've collected over the last 15 years related to individuals' responses to the HIV AIDS crisis. But what exactly is the meaning for me in what John Hill Burton calls this heap of rubbish? To me, the meaning to be derived from these objects is that love makes a difference. The people involved in these efforts didn't have anything to gain personally from their efforts, but they made a conscious decision to put their values into action. And for me, that's the meaning in this so-called heap of rubbish that I just showed you. But what about the COVID era, Randy? My long lead up was really just to give you a sense of how my own very personal experience informed my strong feeling that many of the objects that have been created since the COVID crisis began 18 months ago, and which are still being created, are worth collecting and preserving. As I mentioned, museums are already on this in a big way, but I believe that there's a unique role and value that individual collectors can bring to this exercise. But it will be up to each collector to find the value or meaning in these objects. In the following slides, I'm going to suggest a few areas that curious and intrepid collectors could consider exploring and maybe even collecting. Now, you could try to track down examples of the most unusual and in many cases bizarre objects that have been created in response to the COVID crisis, like the coronavirus piñata or the hug tunnel that we looked at earlier. Or perhaps try to find on eBay one of these Burger King social distancing crowns that you might have received with your Whopper at one of the restaurant's outlets in Germany last year. But rather than looking at these more commercial objects, I'd like to focus on just a few areas that, in my view, offer a glimpse of a more profound artistic response to the COVID crisis. This is, of course, the Book Club of California. And in a few minutes, I'm going to talk about books as a way to collect the COVID era. But one of the things that first moved me emotionally as the COVID crisis was unfolding were the images I was seeing on the nightly news, and particularly what was happening in New York City in March and April of last year. You had dead bodies being hoisted by forklifts into refrigerator trucks that were serving as temporary morgues. A completely vacant Times Square, and a US Navy hospital docked at Midtown Manhattan. And closer to our home on the West Coast, you had a vacant Powell-Hyde cable car line. Very limited social interaction. Here you see a couple of guys playing park chess in the Dogpatch neighborhood. Both of them were wisely masked up. This was just April of last year when we were still very much in the crisis. And here we see a kind of written exhortation to courage from the owners of the shuttered Dobbs Ferry restaurant in Hayes Valley. And they painted, "We are brave, we are hopeful, we are resilient, we are San Francisco." That restaurant is sadly still shuttered. You see, the photojournalists and artists who captured these and many thousands of images are in a sense collectors. They're collectors of our communal experience during the era of COVID. And if anyone here tonight collects contemporary photography, I think you have a unique opportunity to acquire some really amazing images and curate a very interesting collection. And whether you're a talented amateur photographer or just a snapshot jockey like myself, there are still profound images that can be collected, and you should capture them while you can because they are very ephemeral. Here you see the entrance to a New York City emergency room, and people have used colored chalk and arrows to express that heroes dwell therein. But those colored chalk expressions are all washed away now. Here you see someone simply painted "Thank you, helpers" on a utility box in Denver. This was April of last year as well. The entire world was shut down. Nobody knew how bad things would get, and there were no vaccines. And I'm not advocating the defacing of public property. I'm just pointing out that whoever painted this image understood the sacrifice that people were making to help us get through it and wanted to say thank you. And I really think of these simple, ephemeral street expressions as a sort of a bridge from our most primal emotions about this era to the more traditional forms of literature that we're going to explore in a minute. So whether we're sending out a multi-directional thank you like this one, pointing the way to our heroes, or reminding our fellow citizens that we're capable of profound bravery, I think that these street expressions are an interesting prelude or bridge to what we're going to talk about next. In spring last year, literary columnists were already starting to ask, how might writers respond to the COVID era? Some speculated that, as was the case with 9/11, that literature exploring the COVID era might be several years in coming, while others said that we would be seeing examples very soon. So let's dig into that a bit. But I'm only going to give you a couple of examples in several genres in hopes that your appetite might be whetted for further exploration on your own. What would you say about a novel that is centered around a viral plague that starts in animals and spreads very quickly into the human population? Doctors issue dire warnings, but leaders are hesitant to take the drastic containment steps that are recommended by doctors. And a cruise ship full of stranded sick people is not permitted to dock anywhere, as leaders are afraid of spreading contagion. What about this story? A new virus, first detected in Asia, quickly engulfs the world, shuttering businesses around the globe and bringing travel to a standstill. A divisive US president who has a tanning bed in the White House assures the frightened nation that the pandemic will soon be over, and he appoints his outwardly pious vice president to lead the response. It would be very reasonable to conclude that these are the plots of two of the first novels of the COVID era. However, The End of Men by Christina Sweeney Baird and The End of October by Lawrence Wright were both completed in 2019, right before the beginning of the COVID era. But I think that if one were going to collect COVID era novels, you would have to have these in your collection because of their almost creepy prescience. And I think it's interesting that both of those novels have the phrase "the end" in their titles. But the first major novel of the COVID era that actually takes place in the COVID era, at least according to the wonderful Guardian newspaper, is Ollie Smith's Summer. This was the final installment in this Scottish writer's seasonal quartet. And the story begins in February 2020, just as the COVID virus is picking up steam. And in case you're wondering, autographed first edition copies of this title are still available on some of the major e-commerce sites. And a few months later, and closer to home, Michael Connelly, the creator of the Lincoln Lawyer series, whose main character was portrayed by Matthew McConaughey in the 2011 movie of the same name, published his sixth Mickey Haller novel titled The Law of Innocence. The story takes place from late 2019 through March 2020, with our protagonist hearing on the radio about a mystery virus killing people in China and asking, "Where in the hell is Wuhan?" And later, Mickey, who is in jail on suspicion of murder, is shocked to see his entire legal team walk into the prison for a client conference wearing masks. Interestingly, a number of writers who were actively writing novels in 2020, including reportedly Stephen King, made a deliberate decision to make their most recent stories take place before 2020 so that they didn't have to address COVID in the plots. Something as simple as characters meeting up for coffee would have to include a description of people masking up. And finally, at least for this interest-piquing exercise, in March of this year, Houghton Mifflin announced that it would publish a collaborative novel about the COVID era to be written by a powerhouse group of writers, including Margaret Atwood and John Grisham. The book will be titled 14 Days, an Unauthorized Gathering. And the structure of the story involves a group of tenement dwellers who've been left behind when the, quote, rich flee New York City. They meet every night on the roof of their building to swap stories, which are surreptitiously recorded by the building's super. So those are a few suggestions to consider if you think you might want to read or collect novels that have the COVID era as part of their storyline. Now let's move on to poetry. If you were going to collect examples of contemporary poetry published during the COVID era, you could do no better than to acquire recent issues of Poetry magazine. Here you can see the 8 most recent issues. And in addition to containing some wonderful poetry, I think that some of these cover designs are quite striking. And all of these issues and many more past issues are still available for sale on the Poetry Foundation's website. These issues contain a number of poems directly responsive to the era, including "My friend says I should be thinking about masked intimacy when I think about Leila Olive," by the interestingly named poet, the cyborg Gillian Weiss. In this poem, Cy reflects on her crush with the restaurant worker Leila Olive, whom she describes as being, quote, very exposed. She signs on to Zoom to watch a seminar at 3 a.m. and Googles to try to figure out what masked intimacy would mean should her fantasy about Leila come to pass. And Cy's poem was published in the April issue of Poetry. And the frighteningly titled but wonderful poem, How to Decide Which Human Gets Your Last Ventilator, excuse me here, was written by Emily Weil, who is a poet and a nurse. And that was published in the May issue of Poetry. And in addition to being published in hard copy form, you can also read these poems on the Poetry Foundation's website. But one of the things that was striking to me is how very early on in the COVID crisis, a number of cultural intermediaries began soliciting literary works, including poetry, that would be directly responsive to the times. Austin Poets International, which hosts the country's largest non-juried poetry festival, called in early 2020 for submissions for an anthology dedicated to those impacted by COVID-19. and the National Poets Library of the UK curated an anthology of poems by American poets responsive to the crisis. And neither of these projects have yet produced printed versions of their accepted poetry anthology submissions, but you can read the poems on their websites, and I encourage you to do so. And many collections by individual poets have been published during this time. And one of the most interesting is pictured here. In the early days of the COVID pandemic, Olive Sr. started posting poems on her Twitter and Facebook pages. Each poem was a riff on a word or phrase that was trending during the summer of 2020, which was, after all, the summer of COVID. The printed collection of poems is presented in the chronological sequence in which she originally posted them, but she also has provided an alphabetical index because, as she explains, it was the newly created, quote, pandemic lexicon that first got her engaged in the project. And I'm thrilled that Ms. Senior has given me permission to present and read a couple of my favorite poems from her wonderful collection. F for flattening the curve. We have beaten nature down, exalted straightness. But somewhere are things we can never control. Wildness, always trying to break in. When and where, unnoticed for how long, did this bump in the road emerge? This curve that so urgently needs flattening now. S for separation. 6 feet, 2 meters apart is where we need to stand now to, quote, social distance, to avert disaster, trying not to think that if this distance fails, we fall to lie 6 feet under. And finally, Ms. Senior reminds us in V for vaccine that even while the country was reeling from the effects of the pandemic last summer, the insidious and long-running systematic viruses of hate and injustice continued to take lives also, as we all witnessed with the murder of George Floyd. V for vaccine. How quickly COVID-19 has been upstaged by a more insidious injection of hate into the Black body that has gone viral, boots on the ground, and no social etiquette required. Unless there is rigorous commitment to eradicating poisonous infection, no vaccine to counteract this one will ever be found. Indeed. Okay, so we've talked about novels and poetry of the COVID era. What about children's literature then? I believe that the best examples of children's literature are great because the stories themselves are wonderful, not because they're attempting to be instructive. However, after looking at dozens of children's book titles, I did notice that a number of books were designed to explain to children the honor of doing the right thing for your family, friends, and neighbors, to point out the sacrifices that many were making for the common good, and to make the drastic change in their individual families' lifestyles seem somehow less frightening. And I think those were all admirable goals. And I also noted a lot of surprisingly diverse representations in COVID-era children's books. And I would attribute that, at least in part, to the ease of self-publishing. So let's take a look. Liu and Pham's Outside Inside explained to preschoolers why almost everyone who used to be outside has to stay inside now. Brian Flocka's Keeping the City Going describes how the once bustling streets are empty, but explains to children that some people are still outside, keeping us safe and healthy, delivering our mail and packages, and keeping our grocery stores stocked. And Dr. Daniela Owen's book, Right Now I Am Fine, was written to help children who were having a hard time dealing with stress and anxiety related to the COVID epidemic. Other books attempted to portray examples of communities coming together in positive ways during the crisis. The 7-year-old protagonist in Linda Grant's Together Even When We're Apart learns to do small acts of kindness for his neighbors, like teaching a little girl how to read over video conferencing and calling an older neighbor every day to share a joke. And he observes his neighbors also helping one another by doing things like cooking for a family who've lost their jobs. The Love Behind the Mask was written to help kids understand that wearing a mask is an act of love and is designed to teach caring and empathy. And The Time We Did Nothing shows on one page families and children staying at home, quote, doing nothing, while on the opposite pages are depictions of nurses, doctors, teachers, and other community helpers engaged in the battle against the COVID-19 pandemic. The idea was to show that staying home to avoid the spread of the virus and being actively engaged as an essential worker are both important, so that there's a sense of shared responsibility and shared obligation to one another. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, I've been surprised to see a number of racially diverse presentations of characters in children's books addressing the COVID era. And one book is particularly notable, in my opinion, in that regard. Dr. Lee and the Crown-Wearing Virus was written in order to combat anti-Asian sentiment and violence associated with the virus. The author, Francesca Cavallo, initially posted the story on her website, and people were so inspired by it that volunteers from around the world translated it into more than 30 languages. The author felt that it was important that children around the world know that the first hero of the pandemic was, in fact, a Chinese doctor named Li Wenlang, the ophthalmologist who first raised the alarm that a novel coronavirus was spreading in Wuhan. Dr. Li was threatened with imprisonment by the Chinese authorities, but that did not stop him from speaking out. Sadly, Dr. Li himself succumbed to COVID-19 and died in February 2020. So this is both a story of the virtue of courage and the importance of truth-telling, as well as a counter message to fight anti-Chinese xenophobia and racism. But whether your interest in our written responses to the COVID pandemic lie in a photograph of our most primal expressions of our response to COVID, written on the sidewalk in chalk, a novel written during the COVID era that addresses COVID as part of its central theme, a poet's emotional reaction to the new lexicon of the COVID era, or a children's book that reminds us that indeed there is love behind the masks. The objects and creative expressions of this COVID era are worthy of collecting. I started off this presentation explaining how a quarter century after my 18-year-old self graduated from high school, at the very beginning of the HIV AIDS crisis, the process of collecting helped me to finally derive a meaning, or at least a lesson, from what was otherwise inexplicable about that era. And for me, that lesson was that love makes a difference. And while that same meaning has certainly resonated for me over the last 18 months of the COVID crisis, there's something additional that I've noted. And that is that the creative spirit of the human family seems almost unstoppable. How is it that shortly after we realized that we were in a crisis, street artists were already out creating murals expressing fear, but also hope, and admonishing us to take care of one another? And shortly after that, cultural intermediaries were calling for and receiving submissions from poets and short story writers and photographers and other creative people. And the technology that we've all enjoyed during this time, which was constructed not just from science, but also from the human imagination, the World Wide Web and Zoom and other tools, have allowed us to stay connected even while we've been apart. For me, that's been one of the core meanings or lessons from what has been otherwise inexplicable, that no virus, even a once-in-a-century pandemic, can stop the human creative spirit. Well, okay, Randy, or Smarty Pants, as those who know me best sometimes call me, if you're so excited about the creative human spirit, how is it that you are collecting the COVID era? Well, I'm going to show you. But I need to preface this with a bit of explanation, which is best illustrated with a couple of images. You see, I have a problem. This is an image of just one wall of my library. But what you can't see is that I've employed the trick of double shelving, so that there are almost as many books hidden behind the ones that are visible. And I have 3 other similarly bookcased walls in that room. And I have bookcases and books in every other room of my house except the bathrooms. That's one line of eccentricity that I'm just not willing to cross, at least yet. And as the collectors in the audience who are consistent acquirers will recognize, this is the dreaded stack of bankers' boxes containing uncatalogued books. You see, I have a bit of a space management puzzle, and fortunately, my husband is unwilling to let me simply stack books on the floor. That is a good thing. So I have to be very disciplined, but I promise I won't keep you in suspense. What is thin, contains subject matter contemporary to its publication date, well-designed, and a suitable canvas for artistic expression? This is how I decided to collect the COVID era. One of the things that I noticed early in the crisis is that magazines that were covering the era were employing some incredibly creative artists and designers to construct their covers. And the images were often deliberately provocative or employed the use of metaphor or irony. And that's the filter I decided to employ when constructing a small collection of magazines of the COVID era. So here you can see my filter. The magazines I've collected are either artistically interesting, deliberately provocative, or employ the use of metaphor or irony. So let me take you quickly through the cover images of my collection of 17 COVID era magazines published between March 2020 and March 2021. This is the oldest magazine in the collection, a March 2020 issue of The New Yorker. There's actually no feature article about COVID in this issue, but the image of President Trump with a mask over his eyes rather than his mouth is certainly provocative. Another March 2020 issue of The New Yorker. This one is very graphically interesting. From a distance, it looks like an image of a COVID-19 virus, but on closer inspection, it's actually a circle of dominoes, which might at any minute collapse onto the innocent man in the center. It's a great graphic metaphor. Another interesting early COVID-themed cover is this March issue of The Hollywood Reporter, with its image of the coronavirus in the stylized form of a Star Wars Death Star, again employing a great graphic metaphor that COVID is deadly not just to people, but perhaps to the movie business as well. Anita Kunz's wonderful illustration, Class of 2020. She's portrayed students from a variety of ethnic backgrounds, but unified in that they're all wearing a graduate's cap and a mask, thus graphically delivering the message that viruses are respecters of no persons. Mike McQuaid's fantastic illustration, Tangled Syringe, which he created for a June 2020 issue of the New York Times Magazine. You can see that the metaphorical tape measure, which will be used to measure success in the fight against COVID, isn't straight, but rather, as the title indicates, tangled. And if you look at the syringe's plunger at the top of the illustration, you see that the tape measure doesn't go straight from the plunger to the needle. It takes a circuitous path. And The Advocate for June 2020. The Advocate is the nation's longest continuously published news magazine focusing on issues of importance to the LGBTQ community. It may seem confusing that the image in this issue is a photograph of the AIDS memorial quilt on display until you read the text at the top below the title, which reads, "Half of America says, quote, I can't believe the government would ignore an epidemic that threatens thousands of lives." And queers respond, "Really?" This cover is caustic and provocative and brilliant, in my opinion. Another provocative cover is New York Magazine from August. The lead article is subtitled, "What Will the First Day of School Look Like?" And the cover illustration imagined a returning student wearing PPE coveralls, a mask, a face shield, and plastic gloves. And this poignant cover for the September 21st issue of Time is really a heartbreaker. If you look at the blow up on the right side of the slide, you'll see that at the top left corner of the cover is the date February 29th, 2020, which was initially assumed to be the date of the very first US COVID death. and each date thereafter through September 8th is shown, along with the number of COVID deaths reported that day. While in the center of the image, we see highlighted in white the number 200,000, which was the sad milestone of the number of COVID deaths the US had gotten to by September of last year. At the time, that milestone seemed unbelievable, but the US is now nearing 600,000 COVID deaths. This Economist cover from October 2020 is fascinating. It portrays a kind of COVID abacus, again employing an interesting use of metaphor. And the counting balls on the abacus are in the form of the COVID virus, plus the flags of China, the US, the EU, and Japan. And the headline is titled Winners and Losers. It's hard to imagine any country being a, quote, winner from the COVID experience, but the cover design is brilliant. And another one of my favorite covers of the COVID era, Fred Harper's illustration titled Super Spreader from the Week is wicked and effective and brilliant. In this illustration, the president appears to be engaged in an angry rant with his mouth agape, while mixed with the spittle in his wide open mouth are little COVID-19 viruses. And continuing with the theme of the October White House outbreak, Times October 19th cover shows the chimneys at the White House belching COVID-19 viruses into the air. Molly Ball's lead article for this issue was entitled Patient Zero. This October issue of Scientific American, with its fantastical illustration by Goni Montes, portrays a young woman in a dream state floating in a sea of COVID viruses. The lead article is about the reports of vivid, bizarre dreams related to concerns about COVID, quarantine, social distancing, and masking, and how terms like coronavirus dreams, lockdown dreams, and COVID nightmares were beginning to appear in social media. The New Yorker, November 2020, showing a stylized Empire State Building in the form of a syringe, with Pascal Campion's illustration appropriately titled Hope Again. Again, the New Yorker, with their December 7th cover. Knowing the title of Adrian Tomin's illustration, which is, quote, Love Life, helps us to interpret this image. The young woman in the image is, of course, on a quarantine date. Note that she's dressed nicely, but only from the waist up. She has a cocktail in her hand and is in conversation with someone on her laptop via Zoom or FaceTime, undoubtedly. And scattered on the floor are discarded gloves, masks, hand sanitizer, a profusion of Amazon boxes from receiving at-home deliveries, a plastic takeout food container, and various other detritus of the COVID quarantine experience. New York Magazine in January published Nicholson Baker's fascinating article about the lab leak hypothesis, which was illustrated with this striking image. Newsweek, February 2021. The lead article in this issue discusses how COVID attacks the brain and discusses the so-called brain fog and other lingering effects for survivors. And finally, the most recent magazine in my COVID era collection is this March issue of The Economist. Here you see a sort of mixed or double metaphor in the illustration. From a distance, this appears to be a stylized COVID virus with people of various ethnic and national origins being the virus spikes. The people appear to be holding a trampoline, consistent with the lead title, Bouncing Back, but the subtitle is A Safety Net for the Post-COVID World. So it's apparently a trampoline safety net, whatever that is. So this is how I've managed to find some meaning from John Hill Burton's Heap of Rubbish. And one of the best things about collecting this discrete group of COVID-themed magazines with covers that meet my filter of being either artistically interesting, employing metaphor, or being deliberately provocative, is that they fit easily in a single magazine holder. But whether your interests lay in images of ephemeral street graffiti expressing our most primal emotions about this era, novels of the COVID era, poetry, children's books, or some other creative expression that is the product of this unprecedented era, I hope you will consider collecting the COVID era. I believe that doing so not only holds the promise of finding meaning where there seems to be none, but also of honoring the nearly 3.5 million people worldwide who have died from COVID so far, and the billions who have been impacted by this terrible pandemic. Thank you.
Wow. Wow, Mr. Smarty Pants. That was that was incredible. You might want to turn your video
I'm back.
on. There you are, you're back. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on this really interesting topic, collecting during the pandemic. I especially like the frame of collectors finding meaning versus value. As collectors at the book club, we talk a lot about value. What's it going to be worth? But meaning has a value, as you said, and is part of that worth. And I think for me, it was really kind of impactful for taking us back to 1981 and bringing in the AIDS epidemic as a kind of a parallel for thinking about how you processed that in your life through your collection. All of this is just so interesting. It's so thought-provoking that I think all of the folks here who are putting some stuff in the chat and the Q&A have lots that you've tasked them with. I think the first question that I want to ask that's in some of these chats is it too late to start to collect the COVID era?
I don't think it is, in part because we're still in the midst of the crisis, and it's things. I'm not a physician or a healthcare professional or an epidemiologist or anything like that, but I see the headlines, and still, every day between 5 and 20,000 people, it seems like, according to the New York Times, or in this country, test positive for COVID. People are still getting sick, people are still dying. And also, but I think more importantly, I think a lot of the objects that have just recently been created, these sort of artistic expressions, and some of them will still be created, so as I was exploring novels of the COVID era, there are a lot of novels of the COVID era, because it takes time to write a novel, right? You don't just, you could just whip out a novel, but it probably wouldn't be very good. So I don't think it's too early at all. And I think that there are also a lot of other areas that I couldn't even, can't even imagine or haven't really thought through. So I think if you're interested in collecting this era, that it's certainly not too early, too late, excuse me.
Too late. Never too early, never too late.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's interesting because I made a note. You talked about some of the areas, the book related collecting areas. There's clearly other areas to collect that aren't book related. There'll be movies, right? And music that is COVID related. Art, someone asked about the art of the COVID era. Any thoughts about collecting art? Paintings, I think you mentioned photography. Now would be a great time for contemporary photography. Any other thoughts on other non-book related media that can be collected?
Gosh, it's a really good question, because of course we don't know what we don't know about yet. Well, it hasn't yet been created, but I think, a lot of forms of the visual arts, like sculptures and paintings and things, maybe they're still being created. And so maybe that's because I couldn't really find anything. Wasn't specifically focused on that, but photography was the one area that I saw that there'd been a lot done with. And then also these the kind of immediately responsive street art things. One of the things that I didn't display, just because I didn't have enough time, we could have made this a 2-hour presentation, is that there are some absolutely incredible street art murals that have been created. Just mind-blowing. And they're, so those are kind of permanent for a while, but then they go away. Eventually they get painted over or built over or something. But no, the short answer is no. I don't have a lot of ideas for other kinds of artistic expression. I think hopefully other folks will we'll start thinking about that and searching it out.
Yeah, here in Alameda, where I live, when I go walk my dog in the morning, I still, even now, still see art, usually small, little 8.5 by 11, like cardboard that somebody has painted on with hearts and Alameda Strong, sometimes a heart with a mask on it, that's just hanging from a telephone pole or nailed to a tree. So I think there's that kind of ephemeral art that's out there as well for people to collect.
Sure.
Any thoughts on collecting some of the, I guess, when you go into a building, there's a sign that's posted to the building, which says, wear a mask, social distancing in effect, that some of them are quite artistic and interesting and illustrated. They're not finely made necessarily, but they are, ephemeral representations of the time that we're going through. Do you think that is something that somebody could be getting into?
Absolutely. Museums are already doing that. In fact, a lot of the things that museums were looking for early on in the crisis were things like that, like the kind of signage, the little round dots that you see that say "stay 6 feet apart." And as you mentioned the signs. Also, even things. I mean, these are not things that interest me at all, but I think they're really interesting from kind of capturing our human experience point of view. But even like hand sanitizer dispensers. Like there's been. In the hand sanitizer dispenser industry, is making a fortune right now. Maybe there are some interesting designs out there, but face masks are a really interesting area. I think, there's so much face mask litter everywhere that I saw. And I remember, now I'm less afraid. I'm fully vaccinated. I'll actually try to pick them up and throw them away if I see them. But, for a while, there were all these face masks on the ground and people were kind of afraid to pick them up. Right. But that's an area with almost unlimited artistic expression, and it may be with us for a while. But
yeah, well, I was going to ask you more about your collection, the magazines, but you kind of went through that. I'm interested to, and as a parallel or in contradiction to your collecting around the AIDS epidemic, that was all kind of gastronomy related, right?
It was.
But I don't see any gastronomy related collecting for you in the COVID era.
It's a very good question. And I did sort of look into what is there a connection here? And I saw, especially early on, there were some kind of interesting efforts by people like Jose Andres, for example, he has a big nonprofit wing of his empire that does all sorts of great stuff. But, he was out early feeding first responders. And when the cruise ship was stranded and I think outside San Francisco harbor somewhere, he was bringing food to the boat. I mean, they were literally running out of food. One of the things that I think is sort of different about this crisis, when I didn't set out to do a comparison of the HIV AIDS crisis and the COVID crisis, but through this gastronomy lens, one of the things that I noted is that the government was a lot more active at responding early in the crisis than they were in the HIV AIDS crisis. And there are some very complicated reasons for that. Some of it, I think, is being more generous, is just how our sort of governmental notions of when we should respond in a crisis have evolved. And some of it was, frankly, that a lot of the people who were victims of the HIV/AIDS crisis were not sympathetic figures in a lot of people's minds. And so people were literally starving to death. And so that's why, Project Open Hand and God's Love We Delivered and, the aid and comfort fundraisers. I mean, these things literally did mean that people were getting fed. And I think things were a little different here. There were lots of food banks opening up, and I'm not trying to minimize the description of people suffering who've been impacted and lost their jobs, but
sure,
it was kind of hard for me to find a gastronomy connection that was sort of meaningful relative to that primary collecting interest. And that's when I sort of started to come across the magazine covers and thought, gee, this is really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I thought of just a lot of menus, for example, gastronomy related, don't exist anymore, right? You walk into a restaurant and you have a QR code that you scan and you're looking at your menu on a phone. So you can't collect that necessarily. But I think the other part of menus that are related to the COVID era pandemic are social distancing restrictions, and like you must wear a mask while at your table, right, when not actively eating. Like that would be something that it would be out there, but it's not the same as the benefits and the human element that you mentioned with the AIDS epidemic stuff.
It is an interesting point you bring up. But the other thing I thought was interesting, at least in California, is or in the Bay Area, is how the state liquor laws were instantly loosened. So now you could do, take away booze from your local restaurants. And I think those were really actually good instincts, where it's like, hey, this restaurant is going to go out of business and people are going to, be financially injured and people are going to lose their jobs unless this restaurant can stay open. So it was sort of interesting how, kind of government and businesses work together a little bit more to get through this crisis.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a great question. I'm pulling a couple of people's questions into one, which is, what do you think the exhibitions of the COVID era will look like 50, 100 years from now?
Wow, what a great question.
I know.
Yeah, so, as we sort of, like, a lot of people will be seeing those exhibitions who weren't alive during the time. So they have to be they would have to be, I think, kind of educational in the sense that, they'd have to describe how the pandemic started. And, but that's a great question. Gosh, I wish I had, I wish I had my special glasses to see what that would look like.
You have to start writing your case cards and your exhibition collateral now, so people will understand what it is this item was saying to you, what its meaning was.
Right. Yeah. Well, one of the interesting things is, so far as I know, no museum has yet done an exhibition related to COVID. I may be wrong, there may be some small ones, but a lot of it is because we're still, some people are still not even back to work yet. But I know that the Smithsonian certainly is going to do an exhibition on this because it's so profound. But I wonder how long it'll take them to sort of work through the material that they have, and to try, for the curators to try to figure out what's meaningful. It'll be interesting to see how long it takes before we see our first exhibit.
Yeah, there's an interesting question here about handling or the consideration of copyright and ownership for collecting like digital images and some of this ephemera. Any thoughts on that?
It's a really good question. I mean, like, you probably may have noticed I went through a lot of the slides quickly, but what I tried to do is whenever I saw a digital image, I tried to get some attribution to, at a very minimum, recognize the artist, because I really, artists and creative people really deserve compensation. They do. Now, when those images are already out in the public domain, that's when it gets tricky. So I think at a minimum, we need to try to recognize them. Now, if you were collecting them, it's sort of interesting, right? So you're not out to make a profit, right? You can't actually sell it, but you would like to be able to, whether it's on your computer or whether you print them out and put them in a binder, you'd like to be able to refer to those artistic works. So all I can say is it's a great question. Which I know
no answers yet.
I think we have to recognize the artists whenever we can, and even thank them if we're able to.
Yeah. There's some great ideas in the chat and in the Q&A about ways people can go about collecting the COVID-19 era, including, collecting foreign language materials related to the COVID era, which is kind of an interesting one. Someone also mentions artist books. And I'll share this with you after, Randy, all this a lot of great feedback. Superb job. Excellent. Wonderful. So informative are some of the highlights of the comments here. But there's also some interesting comments about the gastronomy side, which I personally know you're interested in. Somebody mentions recipes as part of during the COVID era. There's a lot of home cooking. Someone mentions that, the home cooking kind of thing just exploded, right? People making bread and cookies at home that might have an angle for people if they're interested in collecting in that area as well.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I mean, I can remember going to the store, grocery store last spring and marveling at the things that they were sold out of. Yeast, like,
yeah, flour,
yeast. But yeah, very interesting how, and I think it's also it'll be interesting to see what kind of stories come out of this too, from a gastronomy theme point of view. But yeah, people were eating at home.
Yeah,
for sure. Many people who probably rarely cooked for themselves found themselves taking out their frying pans again. I'll bet you that stores like Williams-Sonoma and Sur La Table and were probably doing really well, through their mail order business during this time, as people realize, I'm going to have to cook here. I may need to get a new set of knives. It's been a long time.
or a blender or whatever
Right.
it is. Yeah, we had a virtual community meeting last month, I guess, and we talked about book related like blogs and podcasts and things like that. And I know that there was a lot of those related to what people are doing or have been doing during the COVID era, right? People who, here's what I baked this week, right?
Mm-hmm.
Here's the art that I created this week. Someone also mentions artists' books. And I think the question is, what are artists' books gonna look like coming out of the COVID era? And I think it might be a little too soon to tell, because it takes a while for people to kind of put stuff together and create an artist's book.
I can't wait to see.
Yeah, I think that's going to be really interesting. Okay, let me see if there's another question on here. Oh, I thought it would be great if you want to remind people of what your filter was for your collection, because I thought that was really terrific.
Yeah.
And if people are going to collect, they might want to use that as a starting point.
Artistically interesting, deliberately provocative, or employing the use of metaphor.
Nice.
So, and the 17, I probably have 17 others that I kind of acquired as I was thinking about this that I didn't, I may just hand them on or something. They're not that interesting to me, but, I think I definitely didn't want to try to create a comprehensive archive of all magazine reporting during the COVID era. That's something that libraries need to do, but that was my filter.
Yeah, you also have space filter.
Right, space filter, right.
That one
all had to fit into the little magazine holder.
I'm going to wrap up in a minute, but I think it's terrific how you incorporate a Huey Lewis and the News lyric into your presentation. And
Todd Rundgren. And
yeah, that's got to be a first right there. I don't think that has ever happened before. So as I said, there's some great comments here, a lot of thank yous. People really enjoyed this presentation, and I'll go share that with you afterwards, Randy, so you can see all these great things. Oh, there was also a comment about collecting, which is interesting, obituaries of family and friends that were taken by the pandemic. And that reminded me about your comment about some of this collecting is really honoring the people who have passed away, right? And the families who have suffered in your collecting. So I just wanted to tie that up there. Again, another very thought-provoking comment here. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you so much for being our speaker tonight and talking about this really interesting issue. This was terrific. And I think people have a lot to kind of, ponder about what they might do if they want to collect during the COVID era. So thank you.
Thank you.
And I want to thank everyone for attending this Book Club of California event. I do like to recently started closing with kind of a high level thought or a takeaway. And I think there's really one that stands out, or two. Collecting adds to human culture. This is one of the key points that Randy pointed out. And also in terms of meaning, love makes a difference. So that's another takeaway that I hope you all take with you after tonight. Collecting adds to human culture and love makes a difference. So thanks again, Randy. Thanks again, everyone, for attending this Book Club of California program. Please join us for our next online program. It's titled About Auctions, Ins and Outs, Ups and Downs, on Monday, July 12th from 5 to 6:15 p.m. here on Zoom. That's a few weeks from now. It's not next Monday, so you got a couple weeks off, but that's going to be July 12th. And that's going to be a live online presentation by Spencer W. Stewart. He's a collections advisor. He's spoken to the book club audience before. And this is a program that is part of the book club's new series directed at new and curious book collectors. So again, it's called About Auctions, Ins and Outs, Ups and Downs on Monday, July 12th. And you can register for that event online and all book club events online at bccbooks.org/programs, or using the link in the weekly programs emails that you may be receiving from the book club. So again, thanks, Randy. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Be well and take care of yourself. Thank you.